Sarah Martinez walked through the hallways of Jefferson High School with her head held high, even though the whispers followed her everywhere she went. Her worn camouflage jacket hung loosely on her small frame, and her combat boots made soft clicking sounds against the polished linoleum floor. To most of her classmates, she was just the weird girl who dressed like she was heading to war instead of chemistry class. "There goes Army Barbie again," Jessica Chan said loud enough for Sarah to hear as she passed by the popular kids' usual spot near the trophy case. The group erupted in giggles, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Sarah had been wearing her father's old military clothing since she started high school 2 years ago. It wasn't a fashion statement or an attempt to look tough. These clothes were all she had left of Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, who had died in Afghanistan when Sarah was just 14. The jacket still smelled faintly of his cologne, and wearing it made her feel like he was somehow still protecting her. The truth was that Sarah's family had been struggling ever since her father's death. Her mother, Elena, worked double shifts at the local diner just to keep their small apartment and put food on the table. There wasn't money for trendy clothes or the latest sneakers that would help Sarah fit in with her classmates. The military surplus store had become their main source of affordable clothing, and Sarah had embraced it as her personal style, even though it made her stand out in all the wrong ways. "Hey, soldier girl," called out Brandon Wright, the star quarterback, as Sarah entered her first period English class. "When are you shipping out to basic training?" His friends laughed, and even some of the quieter students smiled at the joke. Sarah slid into her usual seat in the back corner and pulled out her notebook, pretending she hadn't heard. Mrs. Patterson, their English teacher, had assigned them to write about their heroes for the week's essay. While other students wrote about celebrities, athletes, or historical figures, Sarah wrote about her father. She described how he had joined the military right out of high school, how he had served 3 tours overseas, and how he had saved the lives of his fellow soldiers on multiple occasions. She wrote about the letters he had sent home, full of stories about the children he had met in Afghan villages and the schools his unit had helped build. When Mrs. Patterson asked for volunteers to read their essays aloud, Sarah's hand shot up before she could think twice about it. The classroom fell silent as she walked to the front of the room, her combat boots echoing in the sudden quiet. "My hero is my father, Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "He didn't become a hero because he died for his country, though that's how most people remember him. He became my hero because of how he lived." Sarah read about her father's commitment to protecting innocent people, his dedication to his fellow soldiers, and his belief that service meant putting others before yourself. She described how he had volunteered for dangerous missions, how he had mentored younger soldiers, and how he had never complained about being away from his family because he knew his work was important. As she read, the classroom grew increasingly quiet. The usual whispers and shuffling stopped, and Sarah could see that some of her classmates were actually listening. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence before Mrs. Patterson started clapping. A few other students joined in, though many still looked uncomfortable or confused. "Thank you, Sarah," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "That was a beautiful tribute to your father's service and sacrifice." But, as soon as class ended, the whispers started again. "She's just trying to get sympathy," Sarah heard someone mutter. "My dad says her family is just looking for handouts from the government." The comments hurt more than the jokes about her clothes. These people didn't understand what military families went through. They didn't understand the sleepless nights when her father was deployed, never knowing if he would come home safely. They didn't understand the pride she felt when he called home to tell them about a mission accomplished or a village protected. And they certainly didn't understand the crushing weight of the folded flag that had been handed to her mother at the funeral. During lunch, Sarah sat alone at a table near the windows overlooking the football field. She pulled out the sandwich her mother had packed for her and tried to ignore the table full of popular kids who were clearly talking about her. Their leader, Melissa Thompson, was the mayor's daughter and had never wanted for anything in her life. Her designer clothes and expensive jewelry were just another way she showed everyone how much better she was than students like Sarah. "I heard she wears her dead dad's clothes because her family can't afford anything else," Melissa said, not bothering to lower her voice. "It's actually kind of pathetic when you think about it." Sarah's hands clenched into fists under the table. She wanted to march over there and tell Melissa exactly what she thought about her ignorant comments. She wanted to explain that wearing her father's jacket wasn't about money, it was about honor and memory and love. But she knew that Melissa and her friends would never understand. Instead, Sarah finished her lunch in silence and spent the rest of the lunch period in the library, where the librarian, Mrs. Rodriguez, always welcomed her with a kind smile. Mrs. Rodriguez was a veteran herself, having served in the Navy before becoming a teacher. She understood why Sarah wore what she wore, and she never made her feel ashamed of it. "How are you holding up, Mija?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked as Sarah settled into her usual spot in the corner of the library. "Same as always," Sarah replied with a shrug. "They don't understand, and I don't think they ever will." Mrs. Rodriguez sat down across from her, her expression serious. "Your father would be proud of the young woman you've become, Sarah. Don't let anyone make you forget that." The afternoon classes passed in a blur of more whispers and sideways glances. In biology, Sarah's lab partner reluctantly worked with her but made it clear that she was only doing so because they had been assigned together. In history, the teacher talked about recent military conflicts, and several students turned to look at Sarah as if she were some kind of exhibit in a museum. By the time the final bell rang, Sarah was exhausted from pretending not to care about the constant judgment. She walked to her locker slowly, gathering her books for homework while trying to build up the emotional energy to face the walk home. The other students rushed past her, excited about their plans for the evening parties, shopping trips, movie dates that Sarah could never afford to participate in even if she were invited. As she closed her locker, Sarah caught sight of herself in the small mirror she kept inside. Her father's jacket hung on her like a shield, and, for a moment, she could almost see his face reflected behind her own. He had been so proud when he enlisted, so determined to make a difference in the world. Sarah straightened her shoulders and reminded herself that wearing his clothes meant carrying on his legacy, even if no one else understood. The walk home took her through the older part of town, where many military families lived in modest apartments and small houses. Sarah passed the Martinez family's old neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who always waved and asked how her mother was doing. Mrs. Chen's son had served with Sarah's father during his second deployment, and she understood the sacrifice that military families made. "Tell your mama I said hello," Mrs. Chen called out from her garden. "And, Sarah? Your daddy would be so proud of you, Mija. Don't let anyone tell you different." Sarah smiled and waved back, feeling a little of the day's tension ease from her shoulders. There were people in her community who understood, even if her classmates didn't. There were people who saw her father's jacket not as a costume or a cry for attention, but as a symbol of service and sacrifice. When Sarah arrived home, she found her mother sitting at their small kitchen table, still wearing her diner uniform and looking exhausted from another long day. Elena Martinez had aged years in the tooth since her husband's death, but she still managed to smile when Sarah walked through the door. "How was school today, Mija?" Elena asked, though Sarah could see in her mother's eyes that she already suspected the answer. "The same," Sarah replied, not wanting to burden her mother with the details of another day filled with mockery and misunderstanding. Elena worked hard enough without having to worry about Sarah's social problems at school. But Elena wasn't fooled. She stood up and pulled Sarah into a warm hug, and, for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to feel like a child again, protected and loved despite everything that was wrong with their world. "Your father used to tell me that the hardest battles aren't always fought with weapons," Elena said softly. "Sometimes the hardest battle is just keeping your dignity when other people try to take it away from you." Sarah nodded against her mother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of coffee and vanilla that always clung to Elena's uniform. She thought about her classmates and their cruel comments, and she thought about her father and the courage he had shown every day of his service. "Mama," Sarah said quietly, "do you think Daddy would be proud of me for wearing his jacket to school, even though it makes me different?" Elena pulled back and looked into her daughter's eyes with an intensity that reminded Sarah so much of her father it took her breath away. "Mija, your father wore that jacket to protect people he had never met, in a country thousands of miles away from home. You wear that jacket to honor his memory and to remind yourself of the values he taught you. If that makes you different from the other kids at school, then you should be proud to be different." That evening, as Sarah did her homework at the kitchen table while her mother prepared for another late shift at the diner, she thought about what it meant to be different. Her classmates saw her clothing as strange, but they didn't see the strength it gave her. They saw her family's financial struggles, but they didn't see the resilience those struggles had built. They saw a girl who didn't fit in, but they didn't see a girl who had learned to define herself by her values rather than by other people's opinions. Sarah finished her math homework and moved on to studying for her history test. The chapter covered recent military operations in the Middle East, and she found herself reading with a personal connection that her classmates would never have. These weren't just abstract events in a textbook, they were the places where her father had served, the missions he had been part of, the conflicts that had shaped her family's life. As she studied, Sarah began to feel a familiar sense of purpose. Her father had believed in service, in protecting others, in making sacrifices for the greater good. Those values hadn't died with him, and wearing his jacket was just one way she carried them forward. Tomorrow would bring another day of whispers and jokes, but Sarah was beginning to understand that their opinions said more about them than they did about her. The next morning brought the same routine, the careful selection of her father's clothes, the walk through hallways filled with judgmental stares, the whispers that followed her from class to class. But something had shifted inside Sarah overnight. The comments still hurt, but they didn't diminish her the way they once had. In first period, when Brandon made another joke about her playing soldier, Sarah looked him directly in the eye and said, "My father wasn't playing when he served our country. And I'm not playing when I honor his memory." The classroom fell silent, and even Brandon seemed taken aback by her calm, direct response. Mrs. Patterson smiled proudly from the front of the room, and Sarah felt a spark of the confidence her father had always encouraged her to find. The day continued with its usual challenges, but Sarah faced them differently. When Melissa made a snide comment about military surplus fashion, Sarah simply replied, "Some clothes come from the heart, not from the mall." By lunchtime, word had spread that the quiet girl in camo was starting to stand up for herself. Some students seemed impressed by her newfound confidence, while others doubled down on their mockery. Sarah found herself caring less about their reactions and more about staying true to the values her father had taught her. As she sat in the library during lunch, Mrs. Rodriguez approached her with a newspaper clipping in her hand. "Sarah, I thought you might like to see this," she said, handing over the article. "It's about a scholarship program for children of fallen service members. I think you should apply." Sarah read the article carefully, her heart racing with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The scholarship would cover college tuition and provide support for students who wanted to pursue careers in public service. It was exactly the kind of opportunity her father would have wanted her to have. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah said, looking up with tears in her eyes, "do you really think I have a chance?" "Mija, you have your father's courage and your mother's determination. Of course you have a chance. But, more than that, you deserve a chance." For the first time in months, Sarah felt hope blooming in her chest like a flower after a long winter. Maybe her classmates' opinions didn't matter as much as she had thought. Maybe there was a whole world beyond Jefferson High School where her father's values and her own strength would be recognized and respected. As the school day ended, Sarah walked to her locker with her head held higher than it had been in weeks. She gathered her books and headed for the exit, passing the usual groups of students who whispered and pointed. But, instead of feeling ashamed, Sarah felt proud of who she was and where she came from. The girl in camo was no longer just enduring their mockery, she was rising above it, one day at a time, carrying her father's legacy forward with dignity and grace. And tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that strength came in many forms, not all of them visible to those who only saw the surface. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah began standing up for herself, and the dynamics at Jefferson High School had started to shift in subtle ways. Some students still made jokes about her camouflage clothing, but others had begun to show a grudging respect for the quiet girl who refused to be intimidated. Sarah had submitted her application for the military scholarship and was waiting to hear back, spending her evenings writing essays about her father's influence on her life and her own dreams of public service. The scholarship application process had required Sarah to dig deep into her memories of her father, and she had discovered strength in stories she had almost forgotten. She remembered how he had taught her to tie knots when she was 8 years old, explaining that attention to detail could save lives in his job. She remembered his patient explanations of why he had to leave for deployments, always emphasizing that protecting others was worth personal sacrifice. Most importantly, she remembered his promise that she could accomplish anything she set her mind to, regardless of what other people said about her background or circumstances. Mrs. Rodriguez had become an invaluable mentor during this process, helping Sarah navigate the scholarship requirements and encouraging her to see herself as her father had seen her: capable, determined, and worthy of every opportunity. The librarian had also connected Sarah with other veterans in the community, including Mr. Thompson, who ran the local VFW post and had served alongside Sarah's father during his first deployment. "Your daddy was the kind of soldier everyone wanted on their team, Mr. Thompson told Sarah during one of their afternoon conversations at the VFW hall. He never looked for glory or recognition. He just did what needed to be done, and he did it better than anyone else. These conversations filled Sarah with a pride that had nothing to do with other people's approval and everything to do with understanding her own heritage. She began to see her father's jacket not just as a memento of loss, but as a symbol of values that she could carry forward into her own future. At school, Sarah's newfound confidence had not gone unnoticed by her teachers. Her English essays had become more personal and powerful, drawing on her experiences as a military daughter to explore themes of sacrifice, loyalty, and resilience. Her history teacher, Mr. Garcia, had begun calling on her more frequently when they discussed current events, recognizing that she brought a perspective that her classmates lacked. "Sarah, what do you think about the recent debate over veteran benefits?" Mr. Garcia asked during a discussion about government spending priorities. Sarah stood up slowly, aware that every eye in the classroom was on her. A few months ago, she would have mumbled a quiet response and sat back down as quickly as possible. Now, she spoke with the conviction that came from personal experience. "I think people who have never had a family member serve don't understand what veterans sacrifice," she said clearly. "My father gave his life for his country, and my mother still struggles to pay our bills every month. When people talk about cutting veteran benefits, they're talking about families like mine. They're talking about people who have already given more than most people could imagine." The classroom was completely silent when she finished speaking. Several students looked uncomfortable, but others seemed to be hearing her perspective for the first time. Even Melissa Thompson, who usually rolled her eyes at anything Sarah said, was listening with what appeared to be genuine attention. After class, a girl named Amy Chin, Jessica's younger sister, approached Sarah hesitantly. "Sarah, I wanted to tell you that what you said in class really made me think," Amy said quietly. "I never thought about military families the way you described them. I'm sorry if my sister has been mean to you. She doesn't always think about how her words affect people." Sarah was surprised by the apology, but she accepted it graciously. "Thank you, Amy. That means a lot to me." It was the first time a student had apologized for the treatment Sarah had received, and it gave her hope that maybe some of her classmates were capable of growth and understanding. She began to see that standing up for herself wasn't just about defending her own dignity, it was about educating others and possibly changing their perspectives. The changes at school were gradual but noticeable. While the core group of popular students continued their mockery, others began to engage with Sarah more respectfully. She was invited to join a study group for AP History, where her insights about military conflicts added depth to their discussions. Her lab partner in biology began actually collaborating with her instead of just tolerating her presence. Most significantly, Sarah had begun to make a real friend. Marcus Johnson was a quiet student who had always sat alone at lunch, reading books about aviation and military history. He had been watching Sarah's transformation with interest, and one day he worked up the courage to ask if he could sit with her in the library during lunch. "I've been reading about your father's unit," Marcus said, pulling out a book about recent military operations in Afghanistan. "They accomplished some incredible missions. You must be really proud of him." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at the genuine respect in Marcus's voice. Here was someone who understood that her father's service was something to be honored, not mocked. "He was an amazing soldier," Sarah said, accepting the book Marcus offered her. "But he was an even better father. He taught me that real strength comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Marcus smiled shyly. "I think you learned that lesson well. I've been watching you handle all the stupid comments people make, and I think you're one of the strongest people in our school." Their friendship grew quickly, based on mutual respect and shared interests in military history and public service. Marcus's father was a firefighter, so he understood something about families dedicated to protecting others. Together, they began eating lunch in the library and discussing books, current events, and their plans for the future. Sarah's grades had been improving steadily as her confidence grew, and several of her teachers had begun encouraging her to consider more challenging courses for her senior year. Mrs. Patterson suggested that she take AP English, while Mr. Garcia recommended AP Government. For the first time since starting high school, Sarah began to see herself as college material. The scholarship committee had contacted Sarah for an interview, which would take place at the state capitol in 3 weeks. The interview would be conducted by a panel that included military officers, educators, and community leaders, and Sarah would need to demonstrate not only academic ability but also leadership potential and commitment to public service. "Mija, you need something nice to wear for this interview," Elena said one evening as they discussed the upcoming trip to the capital. "Your father's jacket is perfect for school, but for something this important, you need to look professional." Sarah felt a moment of panic. They had no money for professional clothing, and she had grown so accustomed to wearing her father's military surplus that she wasn't even sure what professional would look like on her. Mrs. Rodriguez solved the problem by connecting Sarah with a non-profit organization that provided professional clothing to young people who couldn't afford it. The director of the program was a former military spouse who understood exactly what Sarah's family was going through. "Honey, your father served his country with honor, and now it's time for his country to serve you," the director said as she helped Sarah select a conservative blouse and skirt for the interview. "You wear these clothes with pride, knowing that you've earned this opportunity through your own hard work and your father's sacrifice." As the day of the interview approached, Sarah found herself experiencing a mixture of excitement and terror. This was the biggest opportunity of her life, but it was also the most pressure she had ever faced. The scholarship would not only pay for college but also connect her with a network of other military children who understood her background and values. The night before the interview, Sarah sat at her kitchen table reviewing her notes and practicing answers to potential questions. Her mother sat across from her, still wearing her diner uniform but offering encouragement and support. "Your father always said that preparation was the key to success," Elena reminded her daughter. "You know your material, you know your own story, and you know what you want to accomplish. Trust yourself tomorrow, Mija." Sarah went to bed that night wearing her father's dog tags around her neck, a ritual she had started when she began standing up for herself at school. The metal tags were warm from her body heat, and touching them reminded her that she carried her father's courage with her wherever she went. The morning of the interview, Sarah woke up before her alarm and spent extra time getting ready. She put on the professional clothes the non-profit had provided, but she tucked her father's dog tags under her blouse where they would remain close to her heart. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked older, more confident, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Elena had taken the day off from work to drive Sarah to the capital, a sacrifice that represented nearly a day's wages but one that she made without hesitation. As they drove through the early morning traffic, they talked about Sarah's father and how proud he would be to see this day. "He always said you were going to do something important with your life," Elena said, glancing at her daughter in the passenger seat. "He said you had the kind of courage that can't be taught, it just has to be discovered." The interview took place in a federal building downtown, and Sarah felt intimidated by the imposing architecture and formal atmosphere. But, as she walked through the security checkpoint and rode the elevator to the interview floor, she reminded herself that she belonged there. Her grades, her essay, and her personal story had earned her this opportunity. The interview panel consisted of 5 people: a retired Army colonel, a high school principal, a college admissions officer, a local business owner who was also a veteran, and a woman who worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs. They greeted Sarah warmly and invited her to sit at a conference table that felt both official and welcoming. "Sarah, we've read your application and we're very impressed," the colonel said, opening the interview. "Your essays about your father's influence and your own goals were particularly moving. Can you tell us more about how your experience as a military daughter has shaped your values?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak, drawing on the confidence she had built over the past few months. She talked about learning resilience from watching her mother work double shifts, about understanding sacrifice through her father's service, and about discovering her own strength through the challenges she had faced at school. "Being different isn't always easy," Sarah said, looking directly at each panel member as she spoke. "But I've learned that being different can also be a source of strength. My classmates see my father's jacket and think I'm trying to be something I'm not. But I know that wearing his clothes helps me remember who I am and where I come from." The panel asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's academic goals, her plans for college, and her ideas about public service. They seemed particularly interested in her perspective on military families and the challenges they face. "What do you think civilian communities need to understand better about military families?" the VA representative asked. Sarah thought carefully before responding. "I think people sometimes see military families as either heroes or victims, but we're neither. We're just families who happen to believe that serving others is worth the sacrifices it requires. My father didn't die to be called a hero, he lived to make a difference," And, my mother doesn't work 2 jobs because she's a victim, she works because she's determined to give me the same opportunities any other kid deserves. When the interview ended, the panel thanked Sarah for her time and told her that she would hear their decision within 2 weeks. As she and her mother drove home, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with whether she won the scholarship. She had represented herself and her family with dignity, and she had spoken her truth with confidence. Back at school the next day, Sarah found that word of her scholarship interview had spread through the teacher network. Several faculty members stopped her in the hallway to wish her luck, and Mrs. Rodriguez gave her an encouraging hug between classes. Even some of her classmates seemed impressed that she was being considered for such a prestigious opportunity. But not everyone was supportive. During lunch, Melissa Thompson made a point of loudly discussing college plans at the table next to where Sarah and Marcus were sitting. "Some of us have to actually work for our college opportunities," Melissa said, clearly intending for Sarah to hear. "We can't just rely on sob stories about dead parents to get free money." Sarah felt Marcus tense beside her, but she placed a calm hand on his arm to stop him from responding. She had learned that Melissa's cruelty said more about Melissa's character than it did about anything else. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "my father used to tell me that some people build themselves up by tearing others down. He said the best response was to keep building yourself up and let your success speak for itself." 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, Sarah's life changed forever. She was sitting in first period English when the principal's voice came over the intercom. "Sarah Martinez, please come to the main office." "Sarah Martinez to the main office, please." The classroom buzzed with speculation as Sarah gathered her books and walked toward the door. Mrs. Patterson gave her an encouraging smile, and Sarah noticed that several of her classmates were watching her with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than mockery. When Sarah arrived at the main office, she found her mother waiting there with tears streaming down her face. For a moment, Sarah's heart stopped. The last time she had seen her mother cry like this was the day they received news of her father's death. But then, Elena smiled through her tears and pulled Sarah into a fierce hug. "Mija, you did it," Elena whispered into Sarah's ear. "You got the scholarship. Full tuition, plus a stipend for living expenses. You're going to college, baby. You're going to college." The principal was beaming as he handed Sarah the official letter from the scholarship committee. As she read the words confirming that she had been selected as one of only 20 recipients nationwide, Sarah felt her father's presence so strongly that she almost looked around to see if he was standing behind her. The news spread through Jefferson High School like wildfire. By lunchtime, everyone knew that the girl in Camo had won a full scholarship to college. The reactions were mixed. Some students seemed genuinely happy for her, while others appeared to be struggling with the reality that the person they had mocked and dismissed had achieved something remarkable. Sarah spent lunch in Mrs. Rodriguez's office, calling the scholarship committee to formally accept the award and beginning to plan for the college application process. As she hung up the phone, she looked at the librarian who had supported her through so many difficult days. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I can't believe this is really happening," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "I can believe it," Mrs. Rodriguez replied firmly. "Your father raised you to be strong, your mother taught you to persevere, and you chose to honor both of their lessons. This scholarship isn't charity, Sarah, it's recognition of the person you've already become and an investment in the person you're going to be." That afternoon, as Sarah walked through the hallways of Jefferson High School for what felt like the first time as a scholarship winner, she noticed that something fundamental had changed. Students who had never spoken to her before nodded respectfully as she passed. Teachers smiled with genuine pride. Even some of the popular kids seemed to be viewing her differently. But the most important change was the one inside Sarah herself. She no longer wore her father's jacket as armor against the world's cruelty. Instead, she wore it as a symbol of the values that had guided her to this moment: courage, integrity, perseverance, and the belief that service to others was the highest calling anyone could answer. As she reached her locker at the end of the day, Sarah found a note that had been slipped through the vents. She opened it carefully, expecting another cruel joke, but instead found a message that took her breath away. "Sarah, I wanted to tell you how sorry I am for the way I've treated you. Watching you win that scholarship made me realize that I've been judging you for all the wrong reasons. Your father would be proud of the person you've become, and I hope someday I can be half as strong as you are. Congratulations on your scholarship, you deserve every bit of it. Amy Chin." Sarah folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket next to her father's dog tags. As she walked out of the school building that day, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt proud to be exactly who she was. The weeks following Sarah's scholarship announcement brought changes she never could have imagined. Word had spread beyond Jefferson High School into the broader community, and local newspapers picked up the story of the military daughter who had overcome adversity to earn a prestigious scholarship. The attention made Sarah uncomfortable at first, but she began to see it as an opportunity to represent military families in a positive light. A reporter from the local newspaper interviewed Sarah and her mother at their small apartment, focusing on the challenges military families face and the importance of supporting children of fallen soldiers. The article featured a photo of Sarah wearing her father's jacket, standing next to a framed picture of Staff Sergeant Martinez in his dress uniform. When the article was published, Sarah's phone began ringing with calls from other military families who wanted to share their own stories and express their pride in seeing one of their own succeed. "Mija, you're becoming a voice for people like us," Elena said as she read the newspaper article for the third time. "Your father always said that one person with courage could make a difference for many others." At school, the dynamics continued to evolve in unexpected ways. While most students treated Sarah with newfound respect, a small group led by Melissa Thompson seemed determined to diminish her achievement. They spread rumors that the scholarship was only awarded based on sympathy rather than merit, and they made pointed comments about playing the victim card whenever Sarah was within earshot. "It's not fair that she gets a free ride to college just because her dad died," Melissa complained loudly during lunch. "Some of us have to actually earn our way." Sarah's friend Marcus had grown tired of listening to these attacks on Sarah's character and reputation. One day, he decided to research the scholarship program and present the facts to anyone who would listen. "Do you know what Sarah had to do to win that scholarship?" Marcus asked during a heated discussion in their AP history class. "She had to maintain a 3.8 GPA while working part-time to help support her family. She had to write 5 essays, submit 3 letters of recommendation, and complete 20 hours of community service. Then, she had to travel to the state capitol for a panel interview with military officers and education officials. Out of over 2,000 applicants nationwide, only 20 students were selected. This wasn't charity, this was competition, and Sarah won." The facts Marcus presented began to change the conversation around Sarah's achievement. Students who had been on the fence about whether she deserved the scholarship started to understand the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Teachers who knew about her family's struggles began speaking up more forcefully about her academic abilities and personal character. Mrs. Patterson addressed the issue directly during their English class, using it as a teaching moment about assumptions and prejudice. "When we judge people based on their appearance or circumstances rather than their character and abilities, we reveal our own limitations," she told the class while looking directly at some of the students who had been most critical of Sarah. "Sarah Martinez has shown more resilience, determination, and grace under pressure than many adults I know. Her scholarship is a recognition of excellence, not a consolation prize." The support from teachers and the growing understanding among her classmates meant a great deal to Sarah, but she was most grateful for the connections she had begun making with other military families in the area. Through the VFW Post and military family support groups, Sarah met other children who understood her experiences in ways her classmates never could. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah volunteered at a support group meeting for children of deployed military parents. She shared her story about maintaining her father's memory while building her own future, and she was moved by how many younger children looked up to her as an example of what was possible. "Miss Sarah, do you think I could get a scholarship too someday?" asked Tommy, a 10-year-old whose father was currently deployed in Iraq. "Tommy, if you work hard in school and never give up on your dreams, I think you can accomplish anything," Sarah replied, remembering how empty such words had felt when adults said them to her after her father's death. Now, as someone who had actually achieved her goals, she could offer hope based on real experience rather than just good intentions. The scholarship had also opened doors Sarah hadn't expected. College recruiters began contacting her directly, and several universities expressed interest in having her join their programs for students committed to public service. Sarah found herself considering options she had never dared to dream about before: prestigious schools, specialized programs, opportunities to study abroad, and work with international organizations. But, with these opportunities came pressure and expectations that sometimes felt overwhelming. Sarah was expected to be a role model for other military children, a spokesperson for veteran families, and an example of overcoming adversity. Sometimes she just wanted to be a regular teenager worried about normal things like homework and weekend plans. "I feel like everyone is watching me now," Sarah confided to Mrs. Rodriguez during one of their regular library conversations.
What if I mess up? What if I can't live up to what people expect from me?
Mrs. Rodriguez smiled with the wisdom of someone who had navigated similar challenges during her own military career.
Sarah, the pressure you're feeling is the same pressure every leader feels when they step into new responsibilities. Your father felt it when he was promoted to sergeant. I felt it when I became an officer. The key is to remember that you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be authentic and keep working toward your goals. As Sarah's senior year progressed, she began taking on leadership roles that felt natural and meaningful. She started a support group at school for students from military families, even though there were only 5 members. She organized a Veterans Day presentation that brought local veterans into the school to share their experiences with students who had never heard first-hand accounts of military service. The Veterans Day event was particularly meaningful for Sarah because it gave her a chance to honor her father's memory while educating her classmates about the realities of military life. She coordinated with Mr. Thompson from the VFW to bring in veterans from different branches of service and different eras, creating a living history lesson that captivated even the most disinterested students. "War isn't like what you see in movies," explained Mrs. Garcia, a Navy veteran who had served during the Gulf War. "Most of our time was spent building relationships with local communities, protecting innocent people, and trying to create stability in unstable regions. We weren't heroes, we were just people doing a job that needed to be done." Sarah watched her classmates listening intently to these stories, and she felt proud to have created a space where military experiences could be shared with respect and understanding. After the presentation, several students approached her to ask more questions about her father's service and her own experiences as a military daughter. Even Melissa Thompson seemed affected by what she had heard. She didn't apologize to Sarah directly, but she stopped making disparaging comments about military families and their sacrifices. Sarah noticed the change and appreciated it, even though she no longer needed Melissa's approval to feel confident in herself. As college application deadlines approached, Sarah found herself torn between playing it safe with state schools and reaching for more challenging opportunities. The scholarship covered tuition at any accredited university, but living expenses and other costs would still be a concern for her family. Elena encouraged her daughter to aim high, even though it meant they would be separated by greater distances and Sarah would be entering social environments where she might once again be different from her peers. "Mija, your father didn't play it safe when he enlisted, and look at the difference he made in the world," Elena pointed out during one of their late-night conversations about college choices. "You have a chance to get the best education possible. Don't limit yourself because you're afraid of being different. Being different is what got you this far." Sarah ultimately decided to apply to a diverse range of schools, including several prestigious universities with strong programs in international relations and public policy. She wrote her college essays about the lessons she had learned from her father's service and her own experiences navigating adolescence as a military daughter in a civilian community. Her essay for Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service was particularly personal. "Wearing my father's military jacket to high school taught me that real strength comes not from fitting in, but from standing up for your values even when others don't understand them. My classmates saw camouflage and thought I was trying to be tough. I knew I was trying to be true to the family and community that shaped me. This experience taught me that effective leadership often requires the courage to be misunderstood, and that the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with character, persistence, and unwavering commitment to something larger than yourself." When Sarah submitted her applications, she felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with whether she was accepted or rejected. She had presented herself honestly, shared her story authentically, and demonstrated the growth she had achieved through adversity. The spring of her senior year brought acceptance letters from several universities, including Georgetown, George Washington University, and the University of Virginia. Each acceptance felt like validation not just of her academic abilities, but of the journey she had taken from a mocked outsider to a respected student leader. As graduation approached, Sarah was selected to give a speech as the salutatorian of her class. The honor came with mixed emotions, pride in her achievement, but also awareness that she would be addressing some of the same students who had made her high school years so difficult. Sarah spent weeks crafting her speech, wanting to strike the right balance between celebrating their shared accomplishments and acknowledging the growth that was still needed in their community. She decided to focus on the themes of understanding, respect, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to see the strength in others.
For years ago, I walked into Jefferson High School wearing my father's military jacket and, thinking I had to choose between honoring his memory and fitting in with my classmates, Sarah began her speech, looking out at an audience that included not just her graduating class but also their families and community members. I'm grateful that I chose to honor his memory, because that choice taught me that our differences are often our greatest sources of strength. The students sitting next to you might be struggling with challenges you can't see. They might have perspectives that could change your understanding of the world. They might have stories that could inspire you to be a better person. But you'll never know if you don't take the time to look beyond the surface and see them as they really are. As Sarah continued her speech, she noticed that many of her classmates were listening with the same attention they had given to the Veterans Day presentation. Even Melissa Thompson seemed engaged, and Sarah felt a sense of hope that the lessons of their shared high school experience might continue to resonate long after graduation. We're leaving Jefferson High School with the knowledge and skills we need to succeed in college and careers, Sarah concluded. But, more importantly, we're leaving with the opportunity to be better than we were when we arrived. We can choose to judge others by their character rather than their appearance. We can choose to support each other rather than tear each other down. We can choose to be the kind of people who make our communities stronger rather than weaker. When Sarah finished her speech, the auditorium erupted in applause that lasted longer than any she had ever received. As she walked back to her seat, she felt her father's presence so strongly that she almost turned to look for him in the audience. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and congratulations, Sarah was surprised by the number of classmates who approached her to express their appreciation for her words and their respect for her journey. Amy Chen gave her a heartfelt hug and thanked her for teaching their class about courage. Marcus beamed with pride as he introduced Sarah to his parents as the strongest person I know. Even some of the students who had been part of Melissa's group came over to congratulate Sarah and express regret for their past behavior. While their apologies couldn't undo the pain of earlier years, Sarah accepted them graciously and focused on the possibility that her experiences might help create a more understanding environment for future students. As the graduation celebration wound down, Sarah stood with her mother in the parking lot, still wearing her cap and gown over her father's jacket. Elena was crying happy tears, overwhelmed by pride in her daughter's achievements and gratitude for how far they had both come since Miguel's death. "Your father would be so proud," Elena said, pulling Sarah close. "Not just of your scholarship or your speech, but of the young woman you've become. You took his best qualities and made them your own." Sarah looked back at Jefferson High School one last time, remembering the scared, angry girl who had walked through those doors 4 years earlier. She thought about all the lessons she had learned about resilience, about standing up for herself, about the importance of staying true to her values even when it was difficult. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she prepared for college and the next phase of her life. But, tonight, Sarah Martinez stood as a graduate, a scholarship winner, a class leader, and, most importantly, a young woman who had learned to define herself by her own standards rather than by other people's expectations. The girl in camo had become something her classmates never expected, not a soldier, not a victim, not a character in their high school drama, but a leader, a bridge builder, and a living reminder that strength comes in many forms, and that everyone deserves the chance to be seen for who they really are. 2 months before Sarah was scheduled to leave for Georgetown University, an unexpected phone call changed everything. She was working her summer job at the local library, helping Mrs. Rodriguez process returned books, when her mother called with news that made her hands shake. "Mija, you need to come home right away," Elena said, her voice tight with excitement and disbelief. "There are some people here who want to talk to you. Military people. They say it's about your father." Sarah's heart pounded as she drove home, her mind racing through possibilities both wonderful and terrible. When she pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, she saw a black sedan with government plates parked next to their building. 2 people in military dress uniforms were standing near the entrance, speaking quietly with each other. As Sarah approached, the officers introduced themselves as Colonel Williams and Major Harrison from the Department of the Army. They asked if they could sit down with Sarah and her mother to discuss something important related to Staff Sergeant Martinez's service record. "Ms. Martinez," Colonel Williams began once they were seated in the small living room, "we're here because new information has come to light about your father's final mission. Information that changes our understanding of what he accomplished before he died." Sarah felt her mother reach for her hand as the colonel continued. "Your father's unit was tasked with protecting a convoy of supplies heading to a remote village that had been cut off by enemy forces. The mission went wrong when they encountered a much larger enemy force than intelligence had predicted. Your father made a decision that saved not only his fellow soldiers, but also 37 civilians, including 12 children. Major Harrison opened a folder and pulled out several documents. Staff Sergeant Martinez volunteered to stay behind and provide covering fire while the convoy and his unit evacuated. His actions gave everyone else enough time to reach safety. We've just finished interviewing survivors of that mission, and their testimonies make it clear that your father's courage prevented what could have been a massacre. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the officers continued to describe her father's heroism. She had always known he was brave, but hearing the specific details of how he had sacrificed himself to protect others filled her with a pride so intense it was almost overwhelming. Based on this new information and the testimonies we've gathered, the Army has decided to posthumously award Staff Sergeant Martinez the Distinguished Service Cross, Colonel Williams said. It's the second highest military decoration for valor in combat. The ceremony will be held at the Pentagon in 6 weeks, and we'd like you and your mother to be there to receive the medal on his behalf. Elena was crying openly now, and Sarah found herself thinking about all the times her classmates had dismissed her father's service as ordinary or unremarkable. If they could see this moment, if they could understand the magnitude of what he had done, maybe they would finally comprehend why wearing his jacket meant so much to her.
There's something else, Major Harrison added gently.
The Army would like to invite you to speak at the ceremony. Your story, how you've honored your father's memory while building your own future, has inspired many people in the military community. They think your words could provide comfort and motivation to other military families who are facing similar challenges. Sarah looked at her mother, who nodded through her tears with obvious pride. I would be honored to speak, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotional storm she was feeling. Over the next few weeks, as news of the Distinguished Service Cross spread through their community, Sarah found herself once again in the spotlight. But this time felt different from the attention she had received for her scholarship. This was about her father's legacy, about ensuring that his sacrifice was properly recognized and remembered. The local newspaper ran another front-page story, this time focusing on Staff Sergeant Martinez's heroism and the upcoming ceremony at the Pentagon. The article included quotes from military officials describing the significance of the Distinguished Service Cross and the rarity of such awards. Sarah's former classmates began to understand that they had been sitting next to the daughter of a genuine war hero for 4 years without realizing it. Jefferson High School asked Sarah to return and speak to current students about her father's service and her own journey. Standing in the same auditorium where she had given her graduation speech just 2 months earlier, Sarah addressed a room full of teenagers who looked remarkably similar to the classmates who had once mocked her. When I was a student here, many of you saw my camouflage jacket and thought it was a costume or a cry for attention, Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence she had developed over the years. You didn't know that this jacket belonged to a man who died protecting people he had never met, in a place thousands of miles from home. You didn't know that wearing his clothes was my way of carrying his courage with me every day. Sarah talked about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, about the hidden struggles and strengths that every person carries, and about the damage that casual cruelty can inflict on someone who is already dealing with loss and hardship. I'm not telling you this story to make you feel guilty about how you treated me, Sarah continued. I'm telling you this story because every single person in this room has the power to be kinder, more understanding, and more supportive than you think you do. You never know whose father died serving his country. You never know who is working 2 jobs to help support their family. You never know who is struggling with challenges you can't see. But you can choose to treat everyone with the respect and dignity they deserve. When Sarah finished speaking, the auditorium was completely silent for several long moments before the applause began. Several students had tears in their eyes, and even some of the faculty members seemed moved by her words. After the presentation, Sarah was approached by a young sophomore named Maria, whose older brother was currently deployed overseas. Miss Martinez, thank you for coming back to talk to us, Maria said quietly. I've been getting teased for wearing my brother's military shirts to school, and hearing your story makes me feel like I'm not alone. Sarah gave Maria a warm hug and her contact information, promising to stay in touch and provide support whenever needed. It occurred to her that she had become the kind of role model she wished she had when she was struggling through her own high school years. The ceremony at the Pentagon was both overwhelming and deeply meaningful. Sarah and her mother traveled to Washington, D.C., where they were treated with the respect and honor that military families deserve but don't always receive. They stayed in a hotel near the Pentagon and were given a tour of the building where her father's medal would be presented. On the morning of the ceremony, Sarah put on the professional outfit she had worn for her scholarship interview, but she also wore her father's dog tags under her blouse and carried a small flag that had been draped over his coffin. As they walked through the Pentagon's corridors, Sarah felt the weight of history and the presence of all the service members who had made similar sacrifices. The ceremony took place in a formal hall filled with military officials, other medal recipients' families, and dignitaries from various government agencies. When Sarah's family was called forward to receive her father's Distinguished Service Cross, she felt as if she were moving through a dream that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Colonel Williams presented the medal to Elena, who accepted it with trembling hands and tears of pride. Sarah stood beside her mother, thinking about how much her father would have loved to see this moment, not because of the recognition, but because of how far his wife and daughter had come since his death. When it was time for Sarah to speak, she approached the podium with the same confidence she had shown throughout her transformation from a mock teenager to a respected young leader. "My father never sought recognition for his service," Sarah began, looking out at an audience that included some of the most senior military leaders in the country. He believed that protecting others was a responsibility, not an achievement to be celebrated. But today, as we honor his sacrifice and the sacrifices of all our fallen heroes, I want to share what I've learned about the true meaning of military service. Sarah spoke about the families who support service members through deployments and danger, about the children who grow up understanding that some things are more important than personal comfort, and about the communities that either embrace or ignore the military families living among them. "My father's courage didn't end with his death," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "His courage lives on in every military family that chooses to serve despite the risks, in every child who honors a fallen parent by building a meaningful life, and in every community that recognizes that military families are not separate from civilian communities. We are part of the same American family, united by our commitment to protecting the values and freedoms that make our country strong." When Sarah finished her speech, she received a standing ovation from the entire audience. Several senior officers approached her afterward to express their admiration for her words and her journey, and many shared their own stories about the challenges their families had faced during their military careers. As Sarah and her mother flew home from Washington, D.C., Elena held her husband's medal in her lap and marveled at how much their lives had changed since Sarah started high school. "Your father would be so amazed by everything you've accomplished," Elena said, looking at her daughter with obvious love and pride. "He always said you were going to change the world, but I don't think even he could have imagined all of this." Sarah smiled and touched the dog tags that still hung around her neck under her blouse. "I think he knew that standing up for what's right was going to be important in my life. He just didn't know how much practice I was going to get in high school." When they returned home, Sarah had 3 weeks left before starting college. She spent that time working at the library, volunteering with military family support groups, and preparing for the next chapter of her life. The local community had embraced her as a hometown success story, and she found herself invited to speak at various civic events and military gatherings. 1 week before leaving for Georgetown, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the library. Melissa Thompson walked through the doors looking nervous and uncertain, clearly struggling with whatever had brought her there. "Sarah, I was hoping I could talk to you for a minute," Melissa said, her voice lacking the confidence and cruelty that had characterized her high school persona. Sarah looked up from the book cart she was organizing and nodded toward one of the study tables. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Melissa sat down and took a deep breath before beginning. "I've been thinking about what you said in your graduation speech, and about everything that's happened since then. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you in high school. I was cruel and ignorant, and I said things that I can never take back." Sarah listened quietly, recognizing that this conversation was probably more difficult for Melissa than any test or social situation she had ever faced. "I didn't understand what you were going through, and I didn't try to understand," Melissa continued. "I thought you were different and weird, and I used that as an excuse to be mean to you. But you weren't weird, you were brave. You were dealing with things that would have destroyed me, and you handled them with more grace and strength than I've ever shown in my life." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she listened to Melissa's apology. The hurt and anger from their high school years were still there, but they were overshadowed by a sense of completion and even compassion for the girl who had felt so threatened by Sarah's authenticity that she had lashed out with cruelty. "Melissa, I appreciate you coming here and saying this," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "I won't pretend that the things you said didn't hurt, because they did. But I also understand that we were all figuring out who we were during high school, and sometimes that process makes people act in ways they later regret. Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she continued.
I read about your father's medal, and I realized that while I was making fun of you for wearing his jacket, you were carrying around the grief of losing a genuine hero. I can't imagine how much strength that must have taken.
Sarah reached across the table and touched Melissa's hand gently.
You know what? We can't change how we treated each other in high school, but we can choose to be better people going forward. I hope you'll remember this feeling the next time you encounter someone who seems different or who you don't understand. They talked for a few more minutes about their plans for college and their hopes for the future. When Melissa left the library, she thanked Sarah again and promised to be more conscious of how she treated others. As Sarah watched Melissa walk away, she reflected on how much all of them had grown since starting high school. The girl in Camo who had been mocked and dismissed had become a voice for military families and an inspiration to other young people facing adversity. Her former tormentors had been forced to confront their own prejudices and learn from their mistakes. And her community had gained a deeper understanding of the sacrifices made by military families. On her last day of work at the library, Mrs. Rodriguez presented Sarah with a special gift, a leather portfolio containing copies of all the newspaper articles about her achievements, photos from various ceremonies and events, and letters from military families who had been inspired by her story. This is the record of who you've become, Mija, Mrs. Rodriguez said with tears in her eyes. Your father planted the seeds of courage in your heart, but you're the one who chose to let them grow into something beautiful. Sarah hugged the woman who had been her mentor and supported her through the most difficult years of her life. Mrs. Rodriguez, I could never have made it through high school without you. You saw my potential when I couldn't see it myself. And now you'll go to Georgetown and continue growing into the leader you were meant to be, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. But remember, no matter how far you go or what you accomplish, you'll always be our girl in Camo, the one who taught an entire community about courage, resilience, and the importance of honoring our heroes. The morning Sarah left for college, she stood in her childhood bedroom one last time, wearing her father's jacket and holding the Distinguished Service Cross that now sat in a place of honor on her dresser. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a grieving, angry teenager who felt like she didn't belong anywhere, to a confident young woman heading to one of the nation's top universities with the support and respect of her entire community. As Elena drove her to the airport, Sarah looked back at Jefferson High School and the neighborhoods where she had grown up. She thought about all the lessons she had learned, all the challenges she had overcome, and all the people who had helped shape her into the person she had become. Mama, do you think Daddy knew that wearing his jacket would lead to all of this? Sarah asked as they pulled into the airport parking garage. Elena smiled and reached over to touch her daughter's hand. Mija, your father always said that courage has a way of spreading from one person to another. I think he knew that his courage would live on through you, and that you would find ways to share it with the world. At Georgetown University, Sarah would major in international relations with a focus on veteran affairs and military family policy. She would start a support group for college students from military families, advocate for better mental health resources for children of deployed parents, and work with professors who had connections to the Pentagon and State Department. During her sophomore year, she would be invited to speak at a conference on military family resilience, where her presentation would be attended by policymakers working on veteran support legislation. Her story would be featured in a documentary about children of fallen soldiers, and she would testify before a congressional subcommittee about the importance of educational support for military families. But all of that was still in the future. On this day, as Sarah boarded the plane that would take her to Washington, D.C. and the next chapter of her life, she was simply an 18-year-old girl wearing her father's jacket and carrying his courage with her into whatever challenges lay ahead. The girl in Camo had learned the most important lesson of all, that real strength comes not from being tough enough to ignore the world's cruelty, but from being brave enough to face that cruelty with grace, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to becoming the person your values call you to be. As the plane lifted off from the runway, Sarah looked down at the city where she had grown up, transformed, and found her voice. Somewhere below, a new generation of students was walking through the halls of Jefferson High School, each carrying their own hidden struggles and secret strengths. Sarah said a silent prayer that they would find the courage to be themselves, the support to overcome their challenges, and the wisdom to treat each other with the kindness and respect that every person deserves. The girl in Camo was going to college, but, more importantly, she was going into the world as a living reminder that heroes come in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful victories are won not on battlefields, but in the everyday choice to stand up for what's right, even when standing up means standing alone.